Welcome back to Eye on Crime. I'm your host, Tom Shalero, and we are cooking on this issue. Let me tell you, we're talking about the incident in Waco, Texas, where there was a rivalry or some sort of dispute between motorcycle gangs. But that's kind of being disputed a little bit now. I have Jim Barr with me. He's president of Long Island and Bay, also the involved with the Coalition of Independent Riders, and also Double D out of the state of Washington. I think he's calling in from Arkansas. And he's also the spokesman and national spokesman for the National Confederation of Clubs and also the state of Washington Confederation of Clubs. And we're talking about rights and profiling. And also, we started to just hit a little bit on what happened that day in Waco, Texas, in that restaurant parking lot. You know, I'm going to start with you, Double D. You left off before the break. You said something that our system, our criminal justice system, is based on the fact that 10 guilty people should go free before we imprison an innocent soul. And I think that that's a great premise to have for a system of a free society that we have here in the American democracy. But let me tell you, when I read that 177, I think the number you gave me, people were arrested that day, and we talk about due process and everybody's supposed to be treated equally in the law. But when I read that, as somebody involved in the system who teaches the system, I've never heard of 177 people getting the same bail.
Oh, it's unprecedented. Not only did they get the same bail, every single one of the probable cause warrants was a generic fill-in-the-blank warrant. There was absolutely no specific or individualized suspicion articulated in any of these warrants. They were generic warrants that were all signed at the same time. That's problematic. In addition to that, correctly, they were all given, you correctly stated, they were all given $1 million bonds. And the prosecutor, in public statements, justified $1 million bonds because he felt like the prisoners were not being cooperative, which is a huge issue. Not only does that violate the Fifth Amendment, individuals' Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and not self-incriminate themselves, but maybe just as importantly is the Eighth Amendment concept that you don't use excessive punishment, including bail, to punish people.
Well, that's right in our Constitution, excessive bail. And it sounded like, now, what was the point of that? They just didn't know what the heck happened in that parking lot, so let's just arrest everybody and lock them up and throw away the key. Is that what happened?
Well, that's exactly what happened. They arrested 177 individuals, the vast majority of which we know were simply there to attend a political meeting and had no involvement in any conflict or fight or argument at all, and were arrested merely because they were there. And they were arrested because of their expressed associations to motorcycle clubs. And across the board, they were all arrested on generic warrants and given $1 million bonds based on a stereotype. So, yeah, it would be similar to another tragic event happening in public and them arresting every eyewitness on the scene until they could, quote-unquote, sort it out.
But, you know, you almost seem like
that's not how the criminal justice system works.
Well, no, you almost seem like by doing it that way, it's going to be difficult to find out what really happened. And I'm going to say this and see what I'm very, very curious to see what you have to say. I mean, there's still 9 people shot and dead, so something happened. And some criminality took place. Is there any word other than the fact, or maybe they just convoluted everything by arresting so many people and trying all of this stuff that we'll never really get to the truth here? Is that?
I believe that's something that we're definitely risking. If you look at all the convoluted ground because of the civil liberty violations and the fact that they're not releasing critical information that they should release. For example, anytime police are involved in a shooting and 9 people are shot and killed dead and 18 people are injured.
I mean, that's a big, I mean, that's a big event.
If there's law enforcement involvement, don't you think we have a right to know whether any undercover officers were on the scene and participated in a conflict? If there weren't undercover officers on the scene, how many of these individuals were injured or killed by law enforcement bullets? And we cannot, draw any conclusions about what happened until either the primary videos are released or until the ballistic reports are released, and they're refusing to do any of those things. And so I believe that every day that they do that, not only do innocents continue to suffer because they have no answer to the crisis at hand, but I also think it breaks down the relationship between the citizenry and law enforcement, which is a huge problem in America now across the board, not just in Waco, but I think it further reinforces that. And I think that is one of the critical things and why this problem is so important. Once the relationship between law enforcement and the citizenry breaks down, then you have an unstable society and the potential for chaos massively increases. It seems like the proper way to approach this, if what they were saying was actually true, would be to release the information that confirms it. I think that when we find out, obviously when we find out who was shot by whose bullets, and when the video is released, we'll know exactly what happened. All those things are important, and we need to discover that. But the most important thing is the 177 people were arrested without probable cause and given $1 million bond.
Yeah, that
primary issue.
That was something that I didn't learn here today on this radio show, but I knew that immediately that there was something awry when it came to that actually happening. Just a curious question: any of those 177 still being held? Most of them were innocent. Obviously, most of them were innocent.
Three of them are still incarcerated. The vast majority of them had their bonds reduced from $1 million to many of them to $25,000, which, it's a huge difference having to come up with $100,000 to cover 10% of a bond and $2,500. So every one of them has been released so far, but three of them. None of the charges have been dropped, however. I mean, they're all facing potential indictment depending on what happens with the grand jury. And that's another question. Look at the grand jury. Your former law enforcement officer. Does it make any sense that they would take a detective from the Waco Police Department that was involved in this process and name him as the foreman of the grand jury that's going to hear these cases?
No.
I mean, there's huge problems with the criminal justice system in Waco, and things like that, I think, magnify that problem. I mean, and I don't want to misquote the organization, but I believe it's the trial lawyers organization from Texas, released a statement after he was announced as the foreman of the grand jury saying this is an absolute conflict of interest and a miscarriage of justice. And think about this. How much easier is it for them if they indict through the grand jury first? How much easier is it for them to get everybody to plead to a lesser charge when all this critical evidence is not released? A man is facing, decades in prison on an organized crime charge, and they offer him to plead it down to disturbing the peace. I mean, most people would go for that, especially since that information has not been released and they don't know the solid footing for a civil rights claim. And so once someone accepts a deal like that, it forecloses the opportunity to sue them for a violation of probable cause.
No, it does, yeah. And that's why plea bargain is 96% of the criminal cases in this country are played out, and they get them out of the system really quick, and we don't have trial by juries, and we get rid of it, and it doesn't cost any money, and it's nice. And that's what the system is. I believe that's the reason why we haven't seen the information, though. I believe that they know, and, I would not be surprised to find out that there were some culpable individuals involved in this incident. We don't know until the evidence is released. Think if they have people like, Jim Barr and Double D and other organizations, you're going to push for this. And I think that's what makes this country great. And the truth tends to come out through a populist movement. It happened in the civil rights movement, happened in the anti-Vietnam War protests and so on. In a situation like this, when you have some questions to be raised, and I'm not saying pro or anti-law enforcement, but for the most part, the questions raised, questions should be answered. And I think it shouldn't be characterized as pro-biker or pro-law enforcement. I think it should be characterized as a pro-free democratic society. Yes. What's best for a free democratic society? And I think that there's legitimate issues on both sides of that line. Absolutely. That's what should drive the discussion. Absolutely.
I'd like to just point out one thing. Yeah,
Jim, we left you out here. Double D's going crazy.
I love listening to him talk. He's great. But one thing, even though it's 8 weeks later now that 174 of the people are out. So I think it's important to just mention to people that these people are out on bail now, but it took weeks for that process to even start. So,
most of them lost their jobs. Most of them lost their primary employment. Many of them lost their property. Many of them, completely had their lives turned upside down and derailed. And even if they're eventually found innocent or have charges dropped, it doesn't stop the destruction that occurred. You can't reverse that.
And what I'd also like to know at some point, what were the stipulations for these people to be released? Because you mentioned the person before, Paul Landers. I've been working with Paul for a year now, working on getting Core into New York. Arrested? Yes. Oh, okay. He's the person that I've been intimately working with. Right. He was instrumental in this. And I've been unable to contact him ever since. His phones are disconnected. His emails are coming back bounced. I'm assuming that there's some kind of blackout that anybody that has been released isn't even permitted to speak to anybody, until this is resolved.
The conditions of release, from what I understand from speaking with the numerous attorneys that are involved in the process, is every single one of those individuals was given a no contact order. They're not allowed to talk or have discussions with anybody who is a member of a motorcycle club, which is a fairly comprehensive restriction considering This man is intimately involved in the motorcycle political rights movement from coast to coast. I mean, he is such an important element and has been such an important element. Paul Landers is who I'm talking about over the last decade, that it's almost unfathomable that he's not allowed to talk to people in his own community. That's his support mechanism and his support system. And so he is a primary example. I mean, he worked for a company for a long period of time, had a good relationship, and, unfortunately through this whole process, he had to find a different source of employment until all of this is sorted out. I mean, you have to understand that from the perspective of an employer. Regardless of whether this issue has been resolved yet, many employers will shy away from a negative publicity related to something like this, and it simply is not worth it for them to take the risk. So a lot of these people lost their livelihoods based on nothing but conjecture. And I think it's a massive miscarriage of justice, and I think that's the reason why we hear the sensationalized view from Waco, because it overwhelms those mistakes.
I'm really hoping that the truth can be told here and that the truth can be known, so some of these people could have their reputations, those that were innocent, and you can't tell me 177 people were involved in this.
The ACLU understands this. I mean, we talked about the nexus between this particular movement and things like the civil rights movement. I mean, the American Civil Liberties Union absolutely understands the relationship between profiling and discrimination, whether it's based on something like race or something like expression.
Okay, we have about 9 minutes left, and there's two areas I want to revisit. We were talking about the profiling thing, and we're talking about, and the fact that the media reporting and the perception of Waco really comes from what both you gentlemen were talking about, and the way the perception that they have of the biker, of the clubs, and so on, and the fact that if they're wearing a patch and their clubs, then and shooting occurred, then it's gang warfare, it's turf warfare, and all criminality is involved, and that's a good part of the theme of what we've been talking about in this hour. But I'm going to say this, and we hit on it just a little bit during our break, isn't it though, when one of the clubs decides that they're going to wear that 1% patch, that's the badge that the police then say, okay, you've already identified yourself with criminality by telling us through a symbol of the 1% patch, that therefore we are going to profile you, we are going to stop you, we are going to search you, we are going to assume that you're going to shoot another gang member. Where are we at with this 1% patch?
Well, the first thing is that's complete mischaracterization of a community that literally consists of thousands of people. The majority of these people are average, everyday people. No, the 1%er badge, in my opinion, and based on my experience and the fact that I know hundreds of people in 1% clubs, it's absolutely untrue. It's not a badge of criminality. If you look at the history of motorcycle clubs, and many of these clubs that are self-identified as 1% clubs, they come out of the post-Vietnam era, the post-war era. They were marginalized when they returned from war, and they found brotherhood in these communities called motorcycle clubs. And this originates back to a statement that was made by the AMA during the hill climbing days, where there was rabble-rousers and rebels at the hill runs, and they said that only 1% of the motorcycling community is not law-abiding. 99% of the community is law-abiding. And a rebellious, disenfranchised community embraced that as a badge of rebellion. It's not a badge of criminality. It's a badge of rebellion. It's saying that we don't need to live by mainstream societies and mores, not legalities, but mainstream societies.
But do you agree that law enforcement, when upon seeing a 1% patch will actually have that perception?
Oh, I absolutely do. That was one of the main problems that we had with profiling in Washington State. They saw, because they saw someone that they identified as a member of an quote-unquote outlaw motorcycle club, that they were highly suspicious they were involved in criminal activity. But that's exactly why we had to pass the law, because that's a perception that is just absolutely not true. I mean, I could go down a list of individuals that I know in 1% clubs in the state that I'm from, for example, and they're all business owners. They're all family people. They're all completely productive and contributing citizens in this society. And to simply, marginalize someone because of their sense of expression, not their behavior, is baseline unconstitutional. And the test that I always use to explain it is if these organizations were illegal organizations, then you wouldn't need a warrant based on action. You could arrest them on site. Obviously, that's illegal. That violates the First Amendment. That violates the Fourth Amendment. That violates the 14th Amendment.
And
we have a right to be members of 1% organizations.
Exactly.
Anyone has the legal right. It's not illegal to be a member. So why is it legal for them to make the presupposition that anyone who wears a 1% diamond is violent or is involved in criminal activity? I mean, it's absurd. And remember that test. These same people who make this label are the ones issuing concealed weapon permits to members of 1% organizations. You know why? Because they don't have felonies, they don't have records, and they pass the background check.
It's a good point that you make, and throughout this program we've been talking about perception versus reality. And, Jim had said something during the break. And, here on Long Island, we have an East End community called Montauk Point. In fact, the East End communities, I say, for the most part, are a great playground for the rich and famous, and not so rich and famous. I know a lot of us Long Islanders will take the nice motorcycle ride out to Montauk Point. And yet, there's just been something recently. The local folks in Montauk have been complaining about the noise and the rowdy bars and things like that. And there was a recent photo, I think, News 12. You could finish up with the story, Jim. I mean, you were a little outraged at what took place.
Oh, I'm very upset. Very upset. Last Wednesday, there was a newscast done on news story on Channel 12 News, and it indicated that the residents in Montauk are complaining that the bars are allowing too many patrons in, and they want to start counting how many people are attending the bars. And they ran 3 different pictures during their broadcast, and one of the pictures was 7 motorcycles parked in front of the Memory Motel with a caption under it that says, "Montauk fighting to crack down on rowdy bar crowds." So that caption underneath this picture, that picture I know was taken in 2012 because it was a Long Island Debate Veterans Appreciation Run that we took to Montauk.
But they were trying to pass it off as something 2015 recently.
Correct. They were giving you the impression that Montauk residents are upset about rowdy bar crowd patrons by showing our picture of our motorcycles at the Memory Motel. That day, we raised $22,000 for our local veterans. We were there for a free lunch at the Memory Motel, and then we left Montauk. But they're trying. The media jumped on an opportunity to say, "See, look, there's rowdy bar crowds. Let's put bikers into that scenario."
And that's exactly
it's irresponsible reporting.
What they did. Double D, we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to give you the last 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Is it frustrating for you? I mean, I think I enjoyed this program, but I'm a little frustrated because I think that a lot has to be done for fairness for all.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes it's frustrating when your entire community and the community you've been around your entire life is marginalized and discriminated against blatantly based on how we look as opposed to how we act. Yeah, that can be frustrating. But, it's more motivating to me than anything. The one thing that I have faith in the American system is our ability to effectuate change in the legislature, particularly state legislatures. And how empowering it is to see hundreds of people show up to the state legislature because they care about their rights base. And I watched it change my reality in Washington State. And so instead of looking at this as merely a crisis, I look at it as a crisis that offers opportunity. If there were ever a time to motivate motorcyclists and people like you who ride motorcycles or are interested in the community to mobilize and come together to deal with and defeat this stereotype, now is the time. And so, yeah, it's frustrating, but it's also motivating. It also makes me look forward to doing things like this, to tell the story of the motorcycle community, tell the story of the Confederation of Clubs, to start becoming more professional and proficient as a community at competing with what I call mainstream sensationalism. And so, although frustrating, it's also motivating. And I have every belief that this can positively happen in other places. As Jim mentioned, they have a bill to defeat profiling sponsored in the New York State legislature currently. That's not the only place. Last year, I worked hand in hand with the state of Maryland, and we were able to pass the legislation through their Senate unanimously. And now we have to pass it through the House this following year. This bill is being adjudicated in a dozen state legislatures currently, and that process is going to continue. So, yeah, although it's a crisis that gives us an opportunity to explain to people who we really are. The community has not participated in media and politics nearly to the degree that we have that we should have. And that's part of the reason we're in the problem. That's part of the reason we're facing the problems we're facing now. We need to change that mentality and take this head on and tell our story.
And I think everything you say is right on. But the problem that I have is that I think 50% of the American people are not even registered to vote. And out of those 50% that are registered to vote on most statewide elections, only about half of those actually show up. We have maybe 20 or 30 seconds. Are you registering bikers? I'm telling you right now, bikers don't vote. And get mad at me if you want, but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. You know, actually, the program that Jim is involved in, the Corps of Independent Riders, is actually the independent arm of what's called the U.S. Defenders, which is part of the Confederation of Clubs. It's the network that combines everyone together. And the thing about the thing about the U.S. Defenders and the thing about CORE is it allows you to...
You know, Double D, I'm going to have to cut you off. We're ending the program, but I'm going to bring you back. You and Jim Barr will come back and give us an update on what's been happening. It's been a great show. Double D, Washington State spokesperson, Confederation of Clubs as a national spokesperson, too, and also Jim Barr, also with the Coalition of Independent Riders. You've been listening to Eye on Crime. I'm your host, Tom Chilero. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you again.